My sister sold the skincare brand built on my formula for $6.8 million. Then the buyer asked for my signature. My sister sold a skincare company for $6.8 million using a formula she did not own and announced the deal while I was sitting alone at the back of the ballroom. Nearly 800 investors, retailers, journalists, and beauty executives rose to their feet as Brielle stood beneath a 20-foot photograph of Barrier 7, the serum that had built Aster Rose skin. She thanked our mother, her investors, her employees, the influencers who had promoted it. Then she pointed toward me, and my sister, Tessa, she said, smiling, who occasionally helped us review some of the technical details. Occasionally. 4 years of laboratory notebooks, dozens of failed prototypes, $31,400 of my own money spent on stability testing, safety assessments, and pilot manufacturing. The complete production process that made Barrier 7 possible. Brielle reduced all of it to one word. What no one applauding in that ballroom knew was that Aster Rose did not own the formula behind its best-selling product. I did. The company had permission to manufacture and sell Barrier 7, but the original licensing agreement contained one restriction Brielle had spent months pretending did not exist. If Aster Rose changed owners, the formula could not transfer without my written consent. 2 days before the acquisition was supposed to close, Meridian's scientific director found that agreement and asked for the only signature Brielle had never obtained, mine. That evening, my sister called me crying. She did not apologize for erasing me from the company's history. She did not explain why she had promised Meridian an asset she had no legal right to sell. Instead, she said, "Do not destroy this family because you wanted more credit." I looked at the unsigned consent form on my screen. Then I gave her my answer. By the following afternoon, the $6.8 million deal she had already celebrated was dead. But to understand why I refused to sign, you need to go back 4 years, when Barrier 7 existed only inside my laboratory notebook, and Brielle still called it our idea. 4 years earlier, Brielle called me from her apartment in Austin with every light turned off. She had spent months testing whatever skincare products were trending online, exfoliating acids, scrubs, strong retinoids, peels that promised perfect skin in 7 days. She had layered too many of them together too often because her audience expected constant reviews. By the time she called me, her face was red, tight, and painfully irritated. Even washing it with water made it burn. Brielle earned much of her income by appearing on camera, but she had stopped posting close-up videos. She told her followers she was taking a creative break. The truth was that she could barely look at herself in the mirror. I was already working as an independent cosmetic chemist and regulatory consultant. Most of my clients were small personal care companies that needed someone to turn promising ideas into products that could survive manufacturing, shipping, and actual human use. I rented space in a shared laboratory on the east side of Austin. It was not glamorous. The ventilation system rattled. The refrigerator door had to be pushed twice before it sealed. I often worked there late at night after finishing the projects that paid my bills. That was where I began making something for Brielle. Not a brand, not a company, just something gentle enough that my little sister could use it without flinching. The first version felt sticky. The second separated after 3 days in a warm room. The fourth pilled under makeup. One version looked perfect in the bottle but made Brielle's skin sting within seconds. I threw away the entire batch. Brielle tested each safe prototype and gave me the kind of feedback no laboratory instrument could provide. This one feels heavy. This one smells like wet cardboard. This one makes my concealer slide off. She made me laugh even when I was exhausted. By the 7th promising version, she called me after using it consistently and turned on every light in her apartment. Her skin was no longer controlling her entire day. She held the plain sample bottle toward the camera and said, "Tess, other people need this." A week later, she mentioned the serum during a live stream. She did not show the bottle or name me. She simply told her audience that her sister had made something that was helping her simplify her routine. The comments filled faster than she could read them. Where could they buy it? When would it launch? Could they join a waiting list? Brielle called me before the live stream had even ended. She said she could build an audience around the product. I said I could prepare it for legitimate commercial production. For the first time, we began discussing a company. Back then, neither of us claimed the idea belonged to only one sister. Brielle understood that I had created the product. I understood that she might be the person who could bring it to the world. At first, that sounded like a partnership. Turning a laboratory sample into something thousands of people could safely buy was more complicated than filling bottles and designing a label. The version Brielle used at home had performed well, but commercial production introduced new risks. A formula could remain stable in a small sample jar and fail completely when mixed in a 500-liter tank. It could react with its packaging, change texture during shipping, or grow bacteria months after leaving the factory. I refused to sell it until I knew it could survive all of that. Because the company had no money yet, I paid the development costs myself. Stability testing, preservative testing, packaging compatibility, an independent safety review, pilot batches at a contract manufacturer. By the time we were ready to launch, I had spent $31,400 through my consulting company, Ward Formulation, LLC. Brielle contributed in a completely different way. She named the brand Aster Rose Skin. She chose the packaging, built the website, photographed the product, and created a waiting list from the people who had followed her recovery. She could explain in 30 seconds what took me 20 minutes to describe technically. I understood skin barrier function. Brielle understood why a customer standing in front of a crowded bathroom cabinet needed to care. Our mother, Elaine, joined us during those early months. She had spent years working in retail marketing and immediately began talking about investors, national stores, and the kind of founder story journalists would want. At first, her ambition felt useful. Before the first production run, my attorney asked a question neither Brielle nor our mother had considered. Who owns the formula? I said I did. I had developed it through Ward Formulation, paid every testing invoice, and maintained the complete technical records. He advised me not to transfer those rights casually, even to family, so we created a licensing agreement. Aster Row received the exclusive right to manufacture and sell Barrier 7. As long as the company remained independent and followed the agreement, no competing brand could use my formula. But there was one restriction. If Aster Row were ever sold or placed under new ownership, the formula rights could not automatically transfer with it. A buyer would need my written consent. The rule was simple. Aster Row could sell the serum. It could not sell ownership of the serum. Brielle signed without objecting. At the time, none of us believed an acquisition was remotely possible. My ownership in the company itself was handled differently. Brielle and Elaine promised me 20% founder equity. They said the shares would be formally issued after we secured our first major retail order. Elaine explained that early investors preferred a simple ownership structure. Brielle told me the delay was only administrative. You already own the important part, she said, tapping the folder containing the license. The equity paperwork will catch up. I should have insisted that it catch up before the first bottle left the warehouse. Instead, I trusted the distinction they offered me. The formula was protected by a contract. My place in the company was protected by a promise. At the time, I believed both were equally reliable. 3 weeks later, Aster Row launched its first production run. By midnight, nearly every bottle was gone. And suddenly, the paperwork everyone had called temporary became much more valuable. Aster Row's first launch was successful, but the moment that changed everything came 6 weeks later. A beauty creator with more than 2 million followers posted an unsponsored video about Barrier 7. She said it was the first recovery serum she had used that did not sting her skin or leave residue beneath makeup. By the following morning, we had sold every bottle in the warehouse. Brielle handled the sudden attention brilliantly. She answered customer questions, organized emergency production updates, negotiated influencer partnerships, and turned thousands of curious viewers into repeat buyers. When people misunderstood the product, she found language that made the science accessible without making it sound childish. I never denied what she built. I had created the serum, but Brielle created the relationship between that serum and the people buying it. Without her, Barrier 7 might have remained a technically strong formula sitting in my laboratory archive. Within a year, a national beauty retailer offered Aster Row its first major purchase order. That was the milestone Brielle and Elaine had named when they promised to issue my 20% founder equity. We celebrated at a restaurant near the river. Brielle ordered champagne. Elaine raised her glass and said we were no longer pretending to be a real company. When dinner was nearly over, I asked when the equity documents would be ready. Elaine's smile changed. She said the retailer onboarding process had created unexpected legal complications. Issuing new shares at that moment, she explained, might alarm potential investors or delay the purchase order. Brielle reached across the table and touched my hand. Just let us complete the onboarding, she said, then we will fix everything properly. I agreed. 2 months later, I followed up by email. This time, Brielle said we should wait until after the company's first outside investment. After the investment arrived, Elaine said the accountant needed to restructure the capitalization table. Then the accountant supposedly needed updated valuations. Then the lawyers were too busy preparing for expansion. Each delay came with a reasonable explanation. None came with a date. At first, I told myself the missing shares were an administrative problem, not a personal decision. The company's early press releases still identified me as the scientist who developed Barrier 7. One trade publication even called me Aster Rowe's technical co-founder. That language reassured me. I believed everyone privately understood my role, even if the legal paperwork remained unfinished. Then Nina Park joined the company as operations director and circulated a presentation for potential investors. On the opening page, beneath a photograph of Brielle, were the words, Brielle Ward, founder and creator of Barrier 7. My name appeared near the end of the presentation under external service providers. I called Elaine immediately. She told me not to overreact. Investors need a simple story, she said. One founder, one vision. It is marketing, Tessa. It does not change what we know. But it did change something. The promise of ownership had begun as paperwork that would eventually confirm the truth. Now the paperwork was being used to create a different truth entirely. And the more valuable Aster Rowe became, the further my place inside it seemed to move away. The investor presentation was not an isolated mistake. 3 months later, Aster Rowe launched a redesigned website. Brielle's photograph covered the homepage beneath the words founder, innovator, product creator. My biography had disappeared completely. I emailed Brielle and Elaine that afternoon. I asked them to restore my role as Barrier 7's formulator and technical co-founder. Brielle replied that the website was still unfinished. We are adding a science page later, she wrote. You will be featured there. The science page never appeared. Instead, Aster Rowe released a new advertising campaign showing Brielle in a white laboratory coat. She stood beside glass beakers and stainless steel equipment, holding a clipboard as though she had personally developed every batch. The photograph had been taken in a rented studio. Brielle had never worked in my laboratory. When I told Elaine the image was misleading, she sighed as though I were objecting to the color of the packaging. Customers connect with a face, not a laboratory, she said. No one wants a chemistry lecture from the person selling them moisturizer. I reminded her that I was not asking to replace Brielle. I was asking them to stop replacing me. Elaine called that distinction emotional rather than commercial. Then a national lifestyle magazine published a profile titled, How Brielle Ward Turned Her Skin Crisis into a Beauty Empire. The article said Brielle had spent 18 months studying ingredients and refining prototypes in her apartment. 18 months was exactly how long I had spent developing Barrier 7. The failed textures, the stability problems, the packaging trials. My work had been turned into her origin story. Before publication, I sent Brielle and Elaine a written request to correct the article. When they refused, I asked them to request a correction afterward. Brielle called me. You know what you mean to this company, she said. Why do strangers need every technical detail? This is not a technical detail, I said. You told them you created something you did not create. She became quiet. Then she said the article was already performing well and changing it would create unnecessary controversy. A month later, during a podcast interview, Brielle said, I created Barrier 7 because nothing else worked for my skin. That was my third written objection. I kept copies of all 3. But I stayed. The license still protected the formula. More than 30 employees now depended on Aster Rowe. And some part of me continued believing Brielle had been carried too far by publicists, investors, and our mother's obsession with a simple founder story. The uglier truth was that I felt ashamed for caring. I had spent years believing competent people did not need recognition. The work should be enough. Asking for credit felt insecure, even petty, so I tolerated being removed one sentence at a time. Then Nina Park invited me to an operations call about manufacturing delays. During the meeting, she introduced me to a new supplier as Astor Rowe's outside laboratory consultant. Afterward, I called her privately. "Nina, where did you get that title?" There was a pause. "That is how you are listed in the company records," she said. That was when I understood the erasure was no longer just advertising. It had become company policy. The first sign that something larger was happening came through a series of requests that did not make sense. Nina asked me to upload every original Barrier 7 testing report to a new secure data room. Elaine called it an insurance review. Then the company requested copies of our manufacturing procedures, safety assessments, packaging records, and correspondence with the contract manufacturer. A week later, Nina asked whether Barrier 7 could be produced at a different facility without changing the formula. That was not an insurance question. New attorneys began appearing on operations calls without introducing themselves. Employees were asked to sign updated confidentiality agreements. Brielle scheduled new corporate photographs and canceled 2 product development meetings with me without explanation. Whenever I asked what was happening, she gave me the same answer: "We are exploring opportunities. Nothing is final." Then Nina accidentally forwarded me a document she had intended to send to Elaine. The subject line read, "Meridian Confirmatory Due Diligence." Outstanding items. Attached was a checklist requesting financial statements, employment agreements, regulatory records, manufacturing contracts, and proof of ownership for every product formula. I stared at the name Meridian Consumer Labs. Meridian was one of the largest personal care companies in the country. This was not a possible partnership. It was an acquisition review. I called Brielle. She answered on the 4th ring and sounded irritated rather than surprised. "How long have you been negotiating with Meridian?" I asked. She paused. "A few months?" "A few months? We did not tell you because there was nothing useful for you to do yet. You are negotiating the sale of a company whose main product uses my formula. And your license will be handled," she said. "The lawyers know about it." Then why did I learn about the transaction from an accidentally forwarded checklist? Brielle exhaled sharply. "Tessa, this is exactly why Mom wanted to wait. You turn every business decision into a personal referendum." I asked her to send me the proposed transaction documents. She refused at first, saying they were confidential. I reminded her that the buyer would require my consent if the formulation rights were expected to transfer. 2 days later, Elaine sent me a short transaction summary. Meridian had agreed to acquire Astor Rowe in a deal valued at up to $6.8 million, subject to final review and closing conditions. The shareholder payment section listed Brielle, Elaine, and the company's investors. My name was absent. I was not surprised that I was missing from the capitalization table. They had never issued the equity they promised me. What shocked me was the intellectual property schedule. It stated that Astor Rowe owned all formulas, technical documents, manufacturing procedures, and product development rights outright. I was listed elsewhere as a consultant who might assist Meridian during a temporary transition period. They were not merely selling the company without including me, they were representing my property as theirs. I emailed Brielle, Elaine, and the company's attorney that evening. I attached the signed license and wrote, "Astor Rowe does not own the Barrier 7 formulation package. Any transfer following a change of control requires written approval from Ward Formulation, LLC. The ownership schedule must be corrected before this transaction is announced or presented as final." No one answered that statement. The following morning, Brielle sent me an invitation to the National Beauty Founders Summit in Las Vegas. She was receiving an entrepreneurship award and delivering the closing speech. Her message said, "I hope you can be there for this. It is a major moment for the family." I was already scheduled to speak on a regulatory panel at the same summit the next morning, so I accepted. Until Brielle walked onto that stage, part of me still believed she might finally tell the truth. The National Beauty Founders Summit was held in a Las Vegas hotel designed to make every business announcement feel historic. The ballroom ceiling was covered in crystal lights. Giant screens displayed photographs of successful founders beside words like vision, courage, and authenticity. Astor Row had reserved 2 tables near the stage. I was not seated at either of them. My badge placed me in the regulatory speaker section near the back of the room, between a packaging lawyer from Chicago and the compliance director of a hair care company. Elaine sat in the front row beside Meridian executives and several of Astor Row's investors. Brielle's senior employees filled the table behind her. No one had saved me a seat. I told myself it did not matter. I had not come for a chair. I had come to hear whether my sister would finally correct the story before attaching a $6.8 million price tag to it. When Brielle's name was announced, the room erupted. She walked onto the stage in a white suit while a photograph of Barrier 7 appeared behind her, enlarged to nearly 20 feet tall. She began with the story of her damaged skin. That part was true. Then she described spending 18 months studying ingredients because no existing product met her standards. She spoke about failed prototypes that separated in warm conditions. She joked about early versions that felt sticky beneath makeup. She described searching for packaging that would protect the formula during shipping. Those were not general details supplied by a publicist. They were memories from my laboratory, my discarded batches, my testing failures, my work. Brielle delivered each one as if it had happened to her. The audience listened in complete silence until she reached the triumphant part of the story. She explained how one woman's personal struggle had become a national brand. Then she smiled toward the Meridian table and announced that the company had signed an agreement to acquire Astor Row Skin in a transaction valued at up to $6.8 million, pending final closing. People stood. Cameras flashed. Elaine placed one hand over her heart as though she were witnessing the reward for a sacrifice only she understood. I remained seated. Brielle thanked her investors for believing in her vision. She thanked Elaine for teaching her how to turn that vision into a company. She thanked the employees, the retail partners, the influencers, and the customers who had shared their recovery stories. Then her eyes moved toward the back of the ballroom. For 1 second, she looked directly at me. "And my sister, Tessa," she said, "who occasionally helped us review some of the technical details." A few people turned and smiled politely in my direction. Then Brielle continued, "That single sentence was worse than leaving me out completely. An omission could have been called an oversight. This was a definition. In front of the people preparing to buy the company, Brielle had reduced 4 years of development, $31,400 of my own money, and the product itself to occasional technical assistance. She knew I was in the room. She knew I had objected in writing. She knew the company did not own the formulation package, and she chose that moment to make the false version official. I did not stand up. I did not interrupt her speech or shout that she was lying. I did not open my phone and upload the license to social media. I waited until the applause began again, collected my bag, and walked out of the ballroom. Nina found me in the hallway several minutes later. She was carrying a folder marked Meridian Integration Planning. "Are you not coming to the transition meeting?" she asked. I was never invited. Her expression changed. I told her I had learned about the acquisition from the checklist she accidentally forwarded. I told her I had requested that the ownership records be corrected and had received no response. Nina looked back toward the closed ballroom doors. Then she lowered her voice. "Tessa, they told us you had already been paid as a consultant." "I was never paid for ownership of the formula. They told Meridian that Astor Row developed it internally. It did not." Nina's grip tightened around the folder. "They also said you had no approval rights over the acquisition." I looked at her without answering. She understood from my silence. "Tessa," she said, "Meridian believes it is buying something the company may not own." I returned to my hotel room while Brielle was still downstairs accepting congratulations. My phone kept lighting up with photographs from the summit. Brielle beside the Meridian executives, Elaine holding the award. Astor Row employees beneath a banner announcing the $6.8 million transaction. For several minutes, I sat on the edge of the bed and imagined posting the license online. I could have placed it beside a clip of Brielle claiming she created Barrier 7. I could have shown everyone the testing invoices, the laboratory records, and the emails in which she promised me founder equity. The lie might have collapsed before the celebration ended. But 32 employees worked for Astor Row. Retailers had open orders. Customers had no idea that the company's ownership records were false. A public explosion would have felt satisfying for one night. It would also have made the truth harder to separate from revenge. So I closed social media and opened the encrypted archive for ward formulation. The first folder contained my laboratory notebooks. Every prototype was dated, every failed batch was recorded. Brielle's feedback appeared in the margins beside my calculations. The next folder contained the $31,400 in invoices I had paid for testing and pilot manufacturing. Then I found the reports themselves. Each one named Ward Formulation, LLC as the study sponsor and Barrier 7 as my development project. I opened the licensing agreement last. The relevant clause was exactly where I remembered it. Aster Row had the exclusive right to manufacture and sell the serum while it remained independently controlled. The rights could not be assigned or transferred after a sale without my written consent. There was no ambiguity. I also collected the emails promising me 20% founder equity, along with the 3 written requests I had made for accurate attribution. Those messages mattered because they showed something Brielle could no longer claim. I had not suddenly become concerned about recognition when millions of dollars appeared. I had asked them to correct the record long before Meridian entered the picture. That night, I called Daniel Mercer, the attorney who had drafted the original license. I sent him the acquisition summary and the intellectual property schedule describing Aster Row as the outright owner. After reviewing them, he said, "Did you ever sign an assignment transferring Ward Formulation's rights to the company?" "No." "Did you approve a change of control?" "No." "Then they cannot give Meridian what they represented they could give." He advised me not to contact the press, the retailers, or Aster Row's investors. I should preserve the records and answer only legitimate requests from the parties responsible for reviewing the transaction. So I prepared a limited evidence packet. It contained enough to establish ownership without exposing confidential scientific details unnecessarily. The following morning, while I was preparing for my regulatory panel, an email arrived from Dr. Hannah Cole, Meridian's scientific director. Her message contained no accusation and no sympathy, only one question. "Can you provide the executed document assigning Ward Formulation LLC's rights in the Barrier 7 formulation package to Aster Row Skin?" I read it twice, then I typed 4 words. "There is no assignment." My 4-word reply reached Meridian at 8:17 that morning. By noon, the acquisition had stopped moving. Dr. Hannah Cole called me shortly after my regulatory panel ended. Her voice was calm and precise. She did not accuse Brielle of lying, and she did not pretend Meridian was contacting me out of concern for my feelings. She was protecting her company from buying an asset it might not legally control. Hannah explained that Meridian's scientific team had been conducting a final review of Barrier 7 before transferring production to one of its manufacturing facilities. That review exposed a pattern. Every original stability report named Ward Formulation LLC as the study sponsor. The safety assessment identified me as the responsible developer. The manufacturing dossier referenced confidential instructions supplied under a separate agreement. And although Aster Row had uploaded thousands of pages to Meridian's data room, it had not provided a single document showing that I had transferred ownership of those materials. "Management described you as a consultant," Hannah said. "I provided technical support after launch," I replied, "but I developed the product before Aster Row existed." "Were you paid to assign the formulation package to the company?" "No." "Did you create it as an Aster Row employee?" "No. I have never been their employee." "Have you approved the transfer of the license to Meridian?" "No." She was silent for a moment. Then she said, "That presents a material problem." The acquisition had been announced, but it had not closed. No purchase money had changed hands. Meridian was still entitled to withdraw if Aster Row could not deliver the assets listed in the agreement. And Barrier 7 was not a minor asset. It generated most of the company's revenue. Hannah asked whether I was prepared to approve the transfer. I told her I could not answer until I understood exactly what Meridian believed it was buying. I requested the description of the formulation rights in the transaction documents, the ownership statements Aster Row had supplied, and Meridian's proposed treatment of my authorship after closing. Hannah said she would provide whatever the confidentiality rules allowed. She did not pressure me. She simply said, "Until this is resolved, Meridian cannot confirm that Aster Row owns transferable rights to its primary product." Less than an hour later, Astor Row received formal notice that the closing had been paused. It was scheduled to occur in 48 hours. My phone began ringing almost immediately. Brielle called 6 times. Elaine called 4. Then messages appeared from numbers belonging to Astor Row's attorney, one of its investors, and a board member who had never contacted me before. I answered none of them while Daniel reviewed Meridian's request. The first voicemail I listened to came from my mother. She did not ask whether the company had misrepresented my work. She did not ask why Brielle had announced the sale before obtaining my consent. Her voice was sharp and breathless. "Your sister is crying," she said. "Call us before you destroy everything." They had spent 4 years treating my ownership as an inconvenient technical detail. Now, with 48 hours remaining, they needed that technical detail to sign their names beneath a $6.8 million transaction. And for the first time since Astor Row began, they could not move forward by simply promising to deal with me later. That evening, I agreed to a conference call with Brielle and Elaine. Daniel joined from his office, but he remained silent. He had advised me to let them explain exactly what they wanted before I responded. Brielle spoke first. She described the ownership problem as a technical misunderstanding. Meridian's lawyers had prepared a 1-page consent, she said. All I needed to do was sign it, and the acquisition could return to schedule. "We can deal with your concerns after closing," she told me. It was the same promise I had heard for years. After the retail order, after the investment round, after the restructuring, after the website redesign, now it was after the sale. I asked what compensation I would receive for transferring the formulation rights. Brielle said the family would take care of me. I asked what that meant in writing. She did not answer. Elaine interrupted. She said Brielle had built the audience, attracted the investors, negotiated the retail contracts, and transformed a laboratory sample into a company worth millions. For once, I agreed with her completely. Brielle built the platform, I said. She created the brand, the customer relationship, and most of the company's commercial value. I have never denied that. Brielle's voice softened. Then you understand why this sale matters. I understand why your contribution matters, I said. I do not understand why you believed it gave you the right to claim mine. The call became quiet. Then I asked them 3 questions. Why was the 20% founder equity you promised me never issued? Elaine began talking about investor expectations and complicated capitalization rules. I stopped her. Why did Astor Row tell Meridian that it owned the formula outright? Brielle said the lawyers had used standard language. The license was written by a lawyer, I replied. It is not standard language. It specifically says the opposite. Then I asked the final question. Why did you announce a $6.8 million acquisition before obtaining the consent you knew the sale required? Neither of them answered. Instead, Brielle began crying. She said the pressure had been unbearable. Employees were expecting bonuses. Investors had already made plans based on the closing. Meridian executives had congratulated her publicly. Industry publications were preparing stories about the acquisition. She described every consequence of the truth becoming visible. She still did not acknowledge the lie. Elaine offered a solution. Astor Row would reimburse my $31,400 in development expenses. After the acquisition closed, Brielle would also arrange a creator bonus from her personal proceeds. Nothing would be paid before I signed. Nothing had been drafted. Nothing was guaranteed. They were offering me another promise in exchange for surrendering the only protection they had been unable to postpone, rename, or remove from the company website. I asked whether Meridian had been told about the promised founder equity. Elaine said that was irrelevant. I asked whether Meridian knew that Brielle's public founder story had been disputed in writing. Brielle's crying stopped. "You are making this about recognition," she said. "You always said you did not care about attention." "I do not want your attention." "Then what do you want?" "An accurate ownership record." She laughed once, sharply. Then she said, "You cannot ruin a $6.8 million company because you wanted your name mentioned in one speech." That sentence clarified everything. To Brielle, the formula was real when it generated revenue. My ownership was real when Meridian needed my signature. But my authorship was merely a desire to be mentioned. I looked at the unsigned consent on my screen. Then I said, "I am not ruining your sale." I am refusing to certify your lie." Elaine began speaking, but I ended the call. Daniel and I reviewed the refusal one final time. It did not demand revenge. It did not threaten public exposure. It did not prevent Astor Row from operating under its existing license. It stated only that Ward Formulation LLC would not consent to transferring the Barrier 7 formulation package under transaction documents that falsely identified Astor Row as its owner. I signed it electronically and sent it to Meridian. At 9:42 that night, Hannah confirmed receipt. 30 minutes later, Meridian notified Astor Row that the acquisition could not close as structured. The deal Brielle had announced beneath crystal lights and a 20-foot photograph of my product was no longer waiting for my signature. It was waiting for the truth they had spent 4 years removing. By the following afternoon, Meridian had completed its preliminary review of the records I provided. The company then exercised its right to terminate the original acquisition agreement. The $6.8 million transaction was over. Meridian's notice did not mention family conflict, hurt feelings, or the speech in Las Vegas. It focused on the only facts that mattered to a buyer. Astor Row had represented that it owned all rights to Barrier 7. It did not. A required third-party consent had not been disclosed or obtained. And without the formulation package, Meridian could not acquire reliable control over the product responsible for most of Astor Row's revenue. Brielle called the termination an act of sabotage. Elaine called it betrayal. One of the investors sent me an email saying I had destroyed years of work over a title. None of them acknowledged that the deal failed because they had promised Meridian an asset they were not entitled to transfer. I still did nothing publicly. I did not send the license to journalists. I did not release Brielle's emails. I did not contact retailers, investors, or influencers to correct every lie at once. Astor Row issued a short statement saying the transaction would not close on the expected schedule because the parties had been unable to resolve outstanding conditions. Inside the company, the explanation was less controlled. Rumors spread quickly. Some employees believed Meridian had discovered a safety problem. Others thought Astor Row was about to lose the right to manufacture Barrier 7 completely. Then the contract manufacturer paused the next production run. Its legal department had learned that the ownership dispute involved the technical instructions required to make the serum. Until it knew who had authority to approve continued production, it would not accept the risk. That was when Nina called me. She did not ask me to rescue Brielle. She asked what would happen to the 32 employees who had never seen the acquisition documents and had never participated in rewriting the company's history. Several had already been told to expect retention bonuses after the sale. Now they were wondering whether the company would survive long enough to make payroll. A few minutes after our conversation, Elaine left another voicemail. This time, she used those employees against me. "You have made your point," she said. "How many innocent people need to lose their jobs before you feel properly recognized?" For one dangerous moment, the accusation worked. I imagined the warehouse staff, the customer service team, and the operations employees who had joined Astor Row believing it was an ordinary growing company. Then I recognized what Elaine was doing. She was combining two separate decisions. I would not authorize anyone to sell my work under false ownership records, but I also did not need to use innocent employees as leverage against the people who had deceived me. Protecting them did not require surrendering my rights. It required a narrower agreement. I called Daniel and asked him to prepare a document that would allow existing production to continue temporarily while the ownership dispute was resolved. No transfer, no sale approval, no waiver of my claims. Only enough stability to keep orders moving and employees paid. The next document I signed did not approve the acquisition. It proved that stopping their lie and destroying their company were never the same thing. The temporary agreement lasted 90 days. It allowed Astor Row to continue manufacturing Barrier 7 under the license it already possessed. Existing retailer orders could be completed. Customers would still receive the product. The 32 employees who had no part in the deception could continue receiving their salaries. But the agreement did not transfer ownership. It did not revive the $6.8 million acquisition. It did not give Brielle or Elaine permission to describe the formulation package as company property. and it did not waive anything Astor Rowe owed me. For the first time, the distinction was written so clearly that no one could reinterpret it later. I was protecting the company's operations without protecting its false history. Nina sent me a message after the contract manufacturer restarted production. "Thank you for separating us from what management did." I read that sentence several times. For years, Elaine had taught me to believe that every boundary would injure someone innocent. If I asked for equity, I might frighten investors. If I corrected an article, I might damage the brand. If I refused the sale, employees might lose their jobs. There had always been someone else's welfare standing between me and the truth. The continuity agreement proved that Elaine's choices were not the only choices available. Several weeks later, Meridian returned with a different proposal. The company was no longer willing to purchase Astor Rowe under the structure Brielle had announced in Las Vegas. The false ownership representations had increased the legal risk, and Meridian's executives no longer trusted the company's internal records without independent verification. But Meridian still valued what Astor Rowe had legitimately built. Brielle had created a recognizable brand, loyal customers, strong retail relationships, and an effective marketing platform. The employees had created functioning operations around it. Those assets were real. They simply did not include ownership of my formula. Under the restructured transaction, Meridian would purchase Astor Rowe's brand, inventory, customer accounts, and operating assets at a substantially lower valuation. The Barrier 7 formulation package would remain the property of Ward Formulation, LLC. Meridian would license it directly from me under a separate long-term agreement. My $31,400 development investment would be reimbursed before the new transaction closed. Future compensation would come through defined licensing payments rather than another promise that my family would take care of me later. The revised documents also required every corporate history, retailer presentation, and public announcement to identify me accurately. Brielle would be named Astor Rowe's brand and commercial founder. I would be named the creator of Barrier 7 and the company's technical co-founder. Neither title erased the other. Meridian also required new controls over scientific and ownership claims. Brielle could continue leading brand communication, but she could no longer make unilateral statements about who created a product or what intellectual property the company owned. Elaine was removed from any role involving contracts, transaction records, or the official company history. Existing employees received retention protection as part of the restructuring. Meridian offered me a senior executive position after closing. The title was impressive, the salary was generous, and 4 years earlier I might have accepted simply because it appeared to prove that I finally belonged inside the company. I declined. I did not want to spend the next decade supervising a culture built around treating my existence as a correction. I wanted a professional relationship with Meridian, not another identity tied to Astor Rowe. 3 months after the original transaction collapsed, the revised deal closed. The announcement did not describe Brielle as a visionary who had created Barrier 7 alone. It stated that Astor Rowe had been built through 2 distinct contributions, Brielle's commercial platform and my scientific work. The company website was corrected the same day. My biography appeared beside the original development timeline, my laboratory role, and my ownership of the formulation package. I expected seeing my name there to feel triumphant. Instead, it felt quiet. The truth had not become more true because Meridian published it. I had created Barrier 7 whether the website acknowledged me or not. What changed was that no one could continue making money from the false version while expecting my cooperation. Brielle had wanted me to sign away my work to save the story she had told about herself. The document I eventually signed saved the employees, preserved the product, and corrected the transaction. It did not save the lie. Brielle apologized for the first time 2 weeks after the restructured transaction closed. She asked to meet at a quiet cafe near my laboratory. When I arrived, she was already seated with a printed copy of Meridian's corrected announcement folded beside her coffee. She said she was sorry the acquisition had become so ugly. She was sorry our disagreement had required lawyers. She was sorry I had felt overlooked. Then she explained how much the original deal's collapse had cost her. The reduced valuation was smaller than the figure she had announced in Las Vegas. Several investors had demanded changes to her authority. People inside the beauty industry were questioning whether they could trust her version of Astor Ro's history. I listened until she finished. Then I said, "You are apologizing for what happened to you after the truth came out. You still have not apologized for what you did to me before it did." Brielle stared at the announcement between us. I said I was sorry you felt overlooked. I was not overlooked. You saw me, you knew what I created, you removed me anyway. She began explaining the pressure she had felt from Elaine, investors, journalists, and retailers who wanted one simple founder story. I did not argue with her explanation. Pressure could explain why she made the choice. It could not transform the choice into an accident. Before leaving, Brielle asked whether we could return to being sisters now that the business dispute was resolved. I told her the business dispute had been documented. The relationship had not been repaired. For several months, we spoke only when the licensing agreement required it. Then Brielle appeared on an industry podcast to discuss Astor Ro's restructuring. The host asked why the company's founder history had changed. Brielle could have blamed lawyers or called it a technical clarification. Instead, she said, "I built the platform, my sister built the product. I allowed people to believe those were the same thing." She admitted that Astor Ro should have formalized my equity and authorship before its first major retail launch. She also acknowledged that I had objected repeatedly, long before Meridian offered millions for the company. After the interview aired, Brielle sent me the link. Her message contained no request for forgiveness, no invitation to praise her publicly, and no reminder that she was still my sister. She wrote only, "I should have said this years ago. That did not restore my trust." But it was the first apology she had given that named her behavior instead of describing its consequences. We eventually resumed limited contact. There were no shared investments, undocumented agreements, or family promises that required me to ignore what was written in front of me. I did not appear in promotional photographs to prove we had reconciled. Brielle did not ask me to protect her from questions about the original founder's story. We spoke carefully and infrequently. It was not the relationship we once had. It was more honest than the one we had pretended to have. Elaine never reached the same point. She continued calling the entire conflict a paperwork misunderstanding. According to her, Meridian's lawyers had exaggerated a correctable technical issue, and I had allowed professional pride to divide the family. I stopped trying to convince her otherwise. Forgiveness, contact, and trust were three separate decisions. Elaine had spent years treating them as one obligation I owed because she was my mother. I no longer did. The week after Brielle's interview, I signed a lease on a larger laboratory across town. For the first time, I was building something no one else would be permitted to explain me out of. I named the new company Ward Standard Labs, not because I wanted my name printed on every product we developed, but because I wanted the standards behind the work to be impossible to misunderstand. Before a scientist mixed the first prototype, before a designer created the packaging, and before anyone announced a launch date, every project answered the questions Astor Ro had avoided. Who created the underlying work? Who owned it? Who had permission to use it? How would the creator be credited? What compensation would be triggered if the product succeeded? What would happen if the company were sold? Nothing important was left to private understanding. Nothing depended on someone remembering a promise after the work became valuable. Some founders resisted that process. They said formal agreements made a new partnership feel distrustful. They wanted to begin with enthusiasm and handle ownership later. I understood the temptation. Early in a project, everyone imagines success will make them generous. But success does not always reveal generosity. Sometimes it reveals incentives. When an idea is worth almost nothing, people are comfortable admitting who created it. Once investors, retailers, and millions of dollars become involved, memory can become remarkably flexible. At Ward Standard Labs, trust was not replaced by documentation. Trust was supported by it. Over time, I began advising other scientists, engineers, designers, and quiet technical founders who had been told that asking for recognition made them difficult. Many of them had made the same mistake I had. They believed credit was about praise. It was not. Credit determined who received compensation, who had authority, who controlled the work, and whose version of history became official. I never began claiming that I built Astor Ro alone. That would have repeated the same dishonesty Brielle used against me. She built the platform. She understood customers in ways I did not. She created attention, trust, and commercial momentum around something that might otherwise have remained in a laboratory notebook. Her contribution was real, so was mine. The problem was never that Brielle wanted recognition for what she built. The problem was that she decided recognition could belong to only one of us. For years, I had treated silence as evidence of confidence. I believed secure people did not need to correct every omission or protect every contribution with a contract. But my silence was not interpreted as confidence. It was interpreted as permission. Permission to delay my equity. Permission to remove my biography. Permission to convert my laboratory records into someone else's founder story. And eventually, permission to sell my work as company property. The missing signature did not destroy Astor Row. It forced everyone involved to distinguish between what the company had built and what it had merely been allowed to use. That distinction cost Brielle the transaction she had announced. It also saved me from signing away my work in exchange for one more promise that the family would take care of me later. I used to believe good work would speak for itself. It did not. People spoke over it. So I learned to put the truth in writing before anyone could turn my silence into consent. Would you have signed the original agreement to preserve the $6.8 million deal, or refused until the ownership record was corrected? Comment in writing if you have learned that trust and documentation are not opposites. And subscribe for more stories about betrayal, accountability, and the moment quiet people finally stop cooperating with the lie. This story is fictional and was created for dramatic storytelling, entertainment, and educational reflection.